Well, hello, and thank you for joining us, and welcome to our webinar today titled Using Deemed Savings and Technical Reference Manuals for Efficiency Programs and Projects. This webinar will run for about 75 minutes, during which time we'll have 3 presentations by 4 speakers. As been noted, all your phone lines for you, the audience, are muted, but if you do have questions, please type them into the text box, and we will do our best to get them answered. The webinar is being recorded. The recording and slides will be available at the LBL webinar website, which is listed on this and other slides of the presentation, hopefully within a few days. And before we formally get started, let me just mention that the funding for this webinar is from the U.S. Department of Energy's Office of Electricity Delivery and Energy Reliability. LBL is coordinating the series with input from and collaboration with the Department of Energy, the U.S. EPA, the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, and the National Association of State Energy Officials, who I all want to thank for their support. So let me start off the webinar by introducing myself. My name is Steve Schiller, and I'm an affiliate and senior advisor in the Electricity Markets and Policy Group at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. I've worked in the energy industry for over 30 years, and with a great deal of that time focused on efficiency and demand response and distributed generation. One of my areas of expertise is in evaluation, measurement, and verification, and I'm the facilitator for this webinar series. LBL, which is hosting the series, is supported by DOE. We conduct non-classified research, and it's operated by the University of California. LBL, also with funding from the Department of Energy, provides technical assistance to states, primarily state energy offices and regulatory commissions. But before I say a few words about the technical assistance, let me just mention our disclaimer here, which you're welcome to review at your leisure. So the technical assistance provided by LBL is intended to be independent and unbiased for state utility regulatory commissions and energy offices, tribes, and regional entities, and we provide that assistance in a wide range of areas such as energy efficiency and demand response, renewables, and different grid topics. Some of them are mentioned here on the slide. Contact information for the technical assistance for state and regional tribal groups is available via the websites listed here. And for those who don't write too fast, again, these slides will be available on the LBL EM&V webinar website probably by tomorrow or the day after. And for that, if you do not have the site, you can Google LBL EM&V webinars. So now on this webinar series, the webinars are designed to support activities for documenting energy savings and other impacts of energy efficiency programs. As mentioned before, it's funded by DOE, coordination with EPA and NARUC and NASIO. And our target audience is utility commissions, state energy offices, state environmental departments, nonprofits involved in operating these energy efficiency portfolios. We expect many more webinars on the EM&V topics, and they'll be noticed on the webinar series website. Again, contact information listed here. The next webinar will likely be in early August on setting baselines for energy efficiency impact evaluations, followed by webinars on evaluating behavior-based programs, and evaluating transmission and distribution efficiency programs, and other topics as we go forward. So today's webinar, we will introduce the use of deemed savings and setting up and updating databases to house the deemed savings. These databases are typically called technical reference manuals, or TRMs. We'll also talk about some lessons learned and provide some resources. I'm going to start with my presentation on some basics of deemed savings and TRMs, and then our speakers will discuss the content and development processes used for the Iowa State TRM and the Northwest Regional TRM. We may have time for clarifying questions after each of these 3 presentations, and we're scheduled to have time for panelists to address your general and perhaps specific questions for the last 10 minutes or so of the webinar. So again, all phone lines are muted, but if you have questions, please type them in the text box, and we'll do our best to answer them. And again, the webinar is recorded with the information available on our website. So here we go. For those who may be joining a bit late, my name is Steve Schiller. I'm with LBL, and I'll be making this first presentation on basics of deemed savings and technical reference manuals as they're used for utility customer-funded energy efficiency programs. So I'm actually going to start my presentation, even before I give you definitions and some more background, with a summary of why you all might be interested in this topic of the webinar, deemed savings and TRMs. Together, they can reduce the cost of evaluating energy efficiency programs and thus save money for the contractors, utilities, other administrators, state agencies, and really the public who's paying for much of this. Next, they create certainty. With deemed savings, everyone knows what savings will be attributed to a particular efficiency action, assuming it's successfully implemented. So no waiting until after the fact to see what the savings can be counted. And because of this, deemed savings can save time in the evaluation, measurement, and verification, i.e. the EM&V processes. Now there are possible downsides. It takes some coordination and effort up front to set deemed savings, and our other speakers will talk a bit about the efforts they've done to move these forward. And it takes time and effort to maintain the TRMs as well. Of course, the deemed savings values can be of poor quality or misused, although that's really true for any approach determining the savings from efficiency actions. So this is why it's of interest for many of us in deemed savings, some cautions. And now with the next slides, let's turn to starting to define these and deemed savings and TRMs. So with that slide, I want to present deemed savings in the context of other ways to determine the savings from efficiency actions. There are three primary approaches used for determining savings from efficiency actions. We have one or multiple webinars about all these, but I'm going to try to summarize this in just one slide. The first approach is measurement and verification, or EM&V for shorthand. This is using options defined by a document called the IPMVP, which is the International Performance Measurement and Verification Protocol. In EM&V involves some sort of measurements for determining the savings on a project-by-project basis to assess the savings using site information on that particular measure or project. The next approach is conducting statistical analysis of large volumes of metered energy use data. This involves utility bill energy consumption data, often with a control group, and is typically applied to mass market programs, for example, residential programs involving weatherization. And then we have deemed savings, the subject of our discussion here today. These are savings values, or possibly set equations, that are stipulated up front and applied to specific energy efficiency measures. They should be based on historical and verified data and are used for well-defined, prescriptive, or standard measures, and involves fixing the savings but still requiring some verification, say to make sure the measures were actually installed. Deemed savings are where TRMs, technical reference manuals, come in. TRMs, shall we say, house the deemed savings values or the deemed calculations. Oops, get to the next slide here. So here's some more formal definitions. Essentially, deemed savings are per unit estimates of savings for specific measures. They're agreed to by all involved up front. And a few examples are listed here, such as deemed savings value for the annual kilowatt hour saved for a 12-watt LED. Because these are deemed, they should only be used for well understood and well documented energy efficiency measures, again, such as examples listed here on the slide. They also should be developed from reliable data sources and analytical methods. And they need to be applied appropriately for the right applications. I'll give some examples on this point soon. I mentioned deemed calculations also, and these are other form of deemed efficiency information for EM&V of efficiency. Deemed savings calculations are agreed to, that is, stipulated engineering algorithms used to calculate the energy under demand savings associated with installed efficiency measure. And there's an example of one of these equations at the bottom of the slide here, just a real simple equation, say, for a lighting retrofit. The TRMs, these are the resource documents or databases or spreadsheets or websites that include and document these deemed savings or deemed savings calculations used for program planning, reporting, evaluating of energy efficiency programs. They tend to be a common reference for utility program managers, implementers, evaluators, and the regulators. And as listed on this slide, they contain a lot of information about the subject efficiency measures and the deemed savings value in calculations, such as the metrics or parameters and factors associated with the deemed savings. Most importantly, they also usually include documentation of the assumptions and calculations used to prepare the values and provide clear indication of what efficiency measures or applications are appropriate for applying the deemed savings and algorithms. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, there are a number of advantages to deemed savings and TRMs. I lay these out a bit more in this slide in terms of saving time and money. Clearly, if you have a predetermined savings value, that's going to save everyone time and money. There's no after-the-fact, ex-post evaluations. In terms of certainty, by having these pre-vetted, pre-approved values, this takes a lot of the risk out of it. And taking out that risk can be of significant value to all those involved. I also mentioned consistency on this slide, because particularly if one is having deemed savings and TRM for entire state, the planning and evaluation values will be calculated using the same methodology and allowing for individual, while of course allowing for individual jurisdiction or specific inputs, say for weather, but by using things such as past evaluation results can be used to really create some certainty for all those involved. And because of these benefits, I would say that they're perhaps the most common approach used for documenting savings from utility demand-side management programs. Maybe some anecdotal information indicating that maybe as much as 80% of the savings in some states are determined with deemed savings. Now, with all these positive things, yes, they can be misused and can cause problems. The values are only as good as the input analysis used to derive them. Garbage in, garbage out, is a pretty good saying. Also, these values tend to be based on averages. So just as an example, they might be a great value, savings value that you can count on as the average for 1,000 homes, but for any particular home, they might be way off. Another potential problem is using the deemed savings values where they shouldn't be applied. For example, using a deemed savings value for weatherization that's calculated for single-family detached houses, but applying it to multifamily apartment buildings. There also can be systematic biases, such as using values that always over or underestimate savings, and not taking into account the interactions of multiple measures that might be occurring within a facility. And then two cautions about deemed savings pointed out in the blue box on the slide here are that the use of deemed values is an agreement to accept the stipulated value, really irrespective of what actually happens. So if you agree to a deemed savings value, you agree to use that value, period. And of course, it's important to realize that technologies alone don't save energy. It's how they're used to save energy. So I want to leave these cautions with you when thinking about the positives. Now, I mentioned that it's important to apply these where appropriate, and this slide illustrates this point. Here's some conceptual data, just made up numbers, but just to show you for the same measure, installing LED lamps, the same measure can have very different savings value depending on their application, things such as operating hours or the different types of lamps they replace. Also, the delivery mechanism, whether it's directly installed or purchased at a hardware store, can affect what's an appropriate savings value. So really, as a bottom line, and perhaps redundantly to say that deemed savings create certainty and consistency. They can be pretty accurate on average and are widely assumed to reduce the state's EM&V cost and focus EM&V resources where they can be of most value. However, as with any tool, you need to be used correctly and with caution. And so they certainly are very popular, but they need to be used correctly. I'm not going to go through all the points on this slide. As I mentioned at the beginning, all these slides are soon to be available online. However, I want to quickly summarize to say that the formats for TRMs can be quite varied, from giant spreadsheets, as is the case in California, to sophisticated databases to simple Word or PDF documents. And in terms of coverage, we'll see utility or EE program administrator specific TRMs, as well as state-by-state TRMs for all the utility customer-funded programs in the state. And next we'll be hearing, of course, about state TRM and then a regional TRM. So who does the evaluation of TRMs? Well, who creates these TRMs? We can maybe start with who does the EM&V, the evaluation, measurement, and verification for most state utility customer-funded programs. And at least from a 2012 survey, it's about one-third utilities, about one-third state utility commissions, perhaps working in conjunction with their utilities, and about one-third others, such as nonprofits or other state agencies that are administering the utility customer-funded efficiency programs. And the vast majority of these entities then rely on consulting firms. There's probably on the order of 2 to 3 dozen or so small to large consulting firms that specialize in this work, and they, of course, would all be happy to create and manage TRMs for states, utilities, or regions. In terms of today's national picture, I mentioned that deemed savings are quite common, and the same is becoming true for TRMs. There are now on the order of about 20 of these TRMs in place or being developed, covering the majority of the country, as can be seen on this slide here. So how these efforts get initiated, this is another slide, as actually with the remainder in my presentation, so we can get to our other speakers. I'm going to go over pretty quickly. These TRMs get initiated as stakeholders ask questions and wonder how they can reduce costs and improve quality by not redoing the analysis all the time. And how can they share resources? The result is most TRMs are just ordered or just agreed to by a commission or perhaps an advisory board if there's a third-party energy efficiency administrator. And what can be barriers to these getting going are related really to money and process. While it's probably cheaper to do a TRM for a whole state or region versus one per utility or one per implementer, these costs tend to be buried, and thus it can be hard to pull the monies together for the TRM, even if they will overall save money. And for the point of certainty, not all commissions approve TRMs, but there appears to be some preference for that to happen. And then this slide here on getting a TRM process started, I'm probably going to just leave this for you, the audience, for future reference, as a series of steps and questions for initiating a TRM process. Similarly, to the last slide, I just want to mention that there's one thing to create the TRM, but it's also necessary to keep them updated. And so I'm going to leave this again for your future reference, some points to consider in updating them, to improve the savings values, add measures that might not have been included in a prior version of the TRM, and suggesting that this updating process should be defined and typically happens in 1, 2, or 3-year cycles. Many states use data from other states, but will then modify the other states' data to be, shall I say, hopefully applicable to their own state, the climate, the market, baselines, market characteristics. The U.S. Department of Energy and LBL conducted a study a few years back looking at some TRMs and comparing their deemed savings values and other information as part of an effort to scope out what would take to set up some more regional TRMs. That study showed a lot of variation in deemed savings values for the same measures, sometimes for good reasons, such as different climates, but sometimes for not good reasons, such as errors in calculations. Tinajayaweera, one of our speakers, was actually the principal author of that report. And with this slide here, which is finishing up my presentation, here's some resources that you might want to look at for more information on TRMs and deemed savings. And this last bullet here on this slide is the web link for that study I just mentioned in the prior slide. So with that, I'd like to turn to our remaining speakers. First, we will have 2 speakers talking about the Iowa TRM, and then a 4th speaker speaking about the Northwest Regional Technical Forum, which is a regional technical reference manual, and much more. Our next presentation will be by Jennifer Easler and Chuck Ray on the Iowa TRM efforts. And let me do a bit of introduction for both of them. Jennifer Easler is an attorney with the Office of Consumer Advocate. It's a division of the Iowa Department of Justice. Her work is primarily in the area of electric and gas utility regulation, including efficiency plans. Among her other roles, she's a member of the State Energy Efficiency Action Network Executive Committee, which is a joint DOE-EPA initiative. And she also assists in administering an energy efficiency collaboration in Iowa through which the current TRM is being developed. Chuck is a director of the Regulatory Strategic Analysis the director of Regulatory Strategic Analysis at Mid-American Energy Company. Chuck is responsible for the direction and coordination of electric and gas cost of service and rate design analysis. He also manages the monitoring and evaluation function for Mid-American's energy efficiency programs and directs and coordinates development of statistical and financial information for efficiency planning and reporting. He also has responsibility for the load research program, sales and revenue process, forecasting, and also the energy efficiency tracking systems, which is probably how he got involved in TRM. So Jennifer is going to start off with discussing their first slides on the Iowa TRM, and then Chuck will cover the remainder with a joint discussion of their lessons learned. And then we'll hear from Tina. So with that, thank you very much, and I welcome you again all to submit questions as you may have them. And Jennifer, please take it away.
Okay. Thank you, Steve, and good morning or afternoon, depending on where you're located. As Steve indicated, I am involved in the Iowa TRM development and thought it might be helpful to give the participants some background on how we got where we are with the TRM. Iowa has been doing energy efficiency for a number of years, and as Steve noted, a deemed savings comes into play through various aspects of energy efficiency plan development and implementation. We are currently under a 5-year cycle, and we develop utility-specific plans and goals, and then the utilities conduct utility-specific EM&V. So there are just a number of times where you are called on to look at the savings assumptions and measure characteristics that go into the plans and the reports that the utilities make about those plans. And we found that that TRM offered an opportunity for greater consistency and transparency in these assumptions. And most importantly, and I failed to include this in my bullet point, is that we're hoping that it will be a more efficient means for keeping track of the deemed savings values and the sources for those assumptions, and will bring some added integrity and reliability to the energy efficiency programs in Iowa. And just a bit more background. We are a state that we don't have a particular energy efficiency resource standard. We don't have a formal integrated resource planning process. Rather, we set energy efficiency goals for the utilities plans based on what is considered to be achievable. The utilities are not directly compensated for energy efficiency savings achievements. In this sort of environment, we had found it probably more convenient to assume a 1.0 net to gross for the energy efficiency measures. And since then, we have been looking at conducting net to gross analysis on measures where we have a pretty good notion that there is some free ridership or spillover occurring, and to try and look at areas where more analysis on net to gross for those particular measures would be useful. We think that a more rigorous process for maintaining the savings assumptions will be useful for external policy considerations. Our regional transmission organizations currently conduct transmission planning assessments based on load forecasts, which include energy efficiency and demand response savings. Also, the EPA's Clean Power Plan. We felt that having a defined TRM could be useful for allowing the state of Iowa to use energy efficiency toward compliance should that come into place. So in our case, the technical reference manual has been adopted as a pragmatic step rather than a policy-driven initiative. And we achieved the TRM through settlement agreements that our utilities board has approved, and the TRM development is occurring primarily through a collaborative process. As you'll see on this slide, the collaborative participants selected the Vermont Energy Investment Corporation as the primary contractor for the development of our TRM. This effort is coordinated by our utilities and has divided the work down through oversight committees and technical committees. In our case, the oversight committee exists to help keep things on track and resolve any policy issues that might arise, and also strive to achieve consensus where there are areas of dispute in the savings assumptions or measure characteristics that come up from the technical committee. And the technical committee, I would say, are our subject matter experts on the TRM components. Each party in Iowa is able to designate appropriate expertise for the technical committee, and those subject matter experts might have ongoing participation or just sporadic as their expertise is needed. As you can see, our oversight and technical committee is comprised of all of our major investor-owned utilities, but also we have been engaging municipal utilities and have left open the door for the Iowa Association of Rural Electric Utilities to participate and just understand the TRM as it's being developed. Participation is open to the parties in the energy efficiency cases, and you'll see all of them listed below there. Ultimately, we want to achieve a product, the technical reference manual, that is used and useful for all of the utilities in Iowa. And that's why we think that this broad engagement is very important, and I think we've done a pretty good job of doing that. We are still at a point where we're nearing finalization of the TRM, but it's something that we will file with the board and request their review of, and bring any issues that we're unable to resolve to the board later this year. I think third quarter 2016 is really kind of our deadline. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to Chuck Ray to talk about more of the technical aspects.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer. This is Chuck Ray with Mid-American, and I'll continue on with kind of the more technical discussion of the development of the TRM in Iowa, how it's been put together, kind of the process that we've used. And I'm going to start off with really kind of what we've tried to put into the TRM. This is an electric and gas document. So it's Jennifer mentioned that the TRM is kind of arrived at through various settlement agreements with the investor-owned utilities in Iowa. There are 3 of them. One is a gas-only utility, and two are a combination, electric and gas. So we have information in this TRM about both gas savings and electric savings, energy and peak demand for both electric and gas. And then we also have some other stuff that relates to the calculation of cost effectiveness. One of the things that we want the TRM to do is to be able to completely support the calculation of cost effectiveness of programs under the Iowa Societal Cost Test. And so that means that we have useful life information for each of the measures, and we have incremental cost information for each of the measures. We've done a lot of work in this TRM on load shapes, and so the TRM will define all of the load shapes that are used for the various programs and assign each of those measures to a load shape. Those are kind of the three big ones. We also have some information on O&M savings where it's appropriate, non-energy related benefits, which we use in cost effectiveness calculations for certain measures, interactive effects, persistence, all of the things that you, hopefully all of the things that you can think of that would go into the calculation of cost effectiveness. So it's not just a savings document. It's not just a savings calculator. It's also something that we're going to use to standardize as much as possible the calculation of cost effectiveness for various programs in Iowa. And so we use this for savings that we report on a quarterly basis, more publicly on an annual basis, and that then becomes the basis for our savings. But we also use this for portfolio evaluation. So when we have our EM&V contractors do work for us, they're very interested in this, and in some cases can have some indirect input into what goes into the TRM, maybe not for the first version, but certainly for the update process that Steve talked about. A lot of that can go into the TRM. Planning and goal setting. We are just starting the process for the next round of planning for the 5-year energy efficiency plans, and the kickoff to that is a statewide assessment of energy efficiency potential. And this TRM that statewide potential study will be the first big test of how well this TRM works, because a lot of the information we talked about on the last slide will go to this potential assessment study and be used for that. And then we have some other compliance requirements coming down the road that we could use this for, environmental compliance requirements that we could use this for. So it's mostly for savings calculations, but it has some other things going forward as well. So the TRM is set up so that there is a page or maybe a group of pages for each measure, and we split the measures up into two different groups. There's a high impact measure group, and then there's a low impact measure group. And this is basically just for the purpose of being able to get the thing done. VEIC started work on the high measure group first, and you can see here kind of a list of all of the things that are included for each measure. There's a measure ID number, not an insignificant thing to have, because that allows us to build systems on the back end to tie into this. So there's an ID number for each measure, name and description. You have to have effective dates. So in some ways this reads a little bit like a tariff. So there's a beginning date and an ending date for the information that's provided. Specifications for what an efficient measure in this classification looks like, and what a base measure looks like, and then kind of the more technical stuff, the savings algorithms, other parameters, lifetime incremental cost, things like that. There are examples, calculations provided in the TRM. So if you can't follow or have trouble following the algorithm, the VEIC group puts in examples for how to calculate savings based on the algorithms that they've just provided. And then as Steve mentioned before, another very important thing is citations. There's a lot of space, a surprising amount of space, physical space, in the TRM devoted to citations and specifications and whatnot. So it's very, very, very well documented, which is something that's pretty important in this, I think. And the process has been pretty good. It basically starts with a set of draft characterizations for various measures that VEIC produces. This is delivered to the technical committee, and there are multiple rounds of discussions with the technical committee. Most of the time there isn't much discussion at all, but there have been some instances, some measures where we have had quite a bit of back and forth. Residential lighting is one that I can think of, where we've had a lot of back and forth. And then once all that has kind of worked itself out, then the EIC presents to the oversight committee. Basically it's the same players, maybe different individuals within each organization, but it's basically the same group of organizations. We present to the oversight committee, the EIC goes through and steps through all of the work that they've done, and then we have discussions and debates, mostly about policy considerations in the oversight committee. And then there's also, kind of at the back end, but it can lead back into the middle somewhere, a fair amount of testing on our part. It's up to the individual utilities to go through this and see what impact the TRM has on calculations of savings compared to what they've already been doing. And that's a pretty important step too. And so that's also a part of the process. Last slide here. Just want to talk, and Jennifer can jump in here too, some of the lessons that we've learned, some of the challenges, and some of the issues that we've had. For me, surprisingly, there have been very few issues or challenges on the technical side. I've come from a technical background, and I wasn't expecting a lot of discussion about technical issues, about how you should calculate savings for this or that or the other thing. But we had even less than what I thought we would have. We had some discussion around lighting calculations. We had some discussion around how to calculate peak demand savings, particularly on the gas side. There was some education that needed to happen with VEIC about our definition of peak day therm savings and how we looked at that. But other than that, not a whole lot of discussion on the technical side. A lot more discussion, and I say relatively speaking, on the policy side. And so we had some issues there. I mean, in Iowa, we're a fairly agreeable lot, so there wasn't a lot of a whole lot of disagreement, but we had more discussion around the approval process, more discussion around when the TRM becomes effective, and what do you do on day one, and what are you expected to use on day one, because we wanted to avoid cherry picking, being able to use some of the measures before some of the other measures. Maintenance issues, updates issues, gross savings versus net savings, what's appropriate to have in the TRM and what's not, things like that. So that kind of lays out how we've worked so far on the TRM stuff, and I think it's gone pretty well. As I said, surprising amount of discussion on kind of the non-technical side of this. And if you're thinking about development of TRMs in your own states or your own regions, that's kind of a bigger issue than you might think, I would say.
Chuck, this is Jennifer. I just wanted to concur. Chuck, you did a nice summary of the lessons we've learned so far, and we are still in the midst of the process, so we probably haven't learned all of our lessons. But I think one challenge with developing and trying to implement a TRM collaboratively is we don't have a direct policy mandate, and we're really kind of working on our own to come up with a process that makes sense. Ultimately, our regulatory commission will review that, but we're kind of in a spot of trying to figure out how to implement this new process in a way that meshes well with existing plan implementation, assessment of potential, and EM&V activities, so that we're able to feed the TRM into those at timely points and realize the efficiencies that we're expecting through the TRM process. And with that, I think that concludes the Iowa experience. I'll hand it off to Tina.
All right. Well, Jennifer and Chuck, this is Steve Schiller again, the moderator, and I want to thank you both for quite quickly going through a lot of material, and I really appreciate it. We've gotten quite a few questions in. I want to thank the audience participants for sending in those questions. There's two that I want to try to see if we can do a bit of clarification right now with Chuck and Jennifer, and then one to leave after Tina does her presentation. The one that I think we'll leave to after Tina's presentation is a discussion, some feedback from all our speakers about why regional versus state TRMs for the Iowa folks, why you decided to go with an Iowa one versus possibly working regionally, and any words of wisdom for possibly using information from existing TRMs to build new state TRMs. But maybe leave that for Jennifer, Chuck, and Tina as we complete Tina's presentation. But for Chuck and Jennifer, two categories of questions that came up were the timing for when the Iowa TRM will be publicly available and complete. And also there was some mention of non-energy benefits in your presentation and the use of those in your cost effectiveness. So I was wondering if you could just fairly quickly mention the timing and also which non-energy benefits you're considering both for the TRM and your cost effectiveness. You can flip a coin over the phone to figure out who's going to speak first on that one.
Well, I will take the question about non-energy benefits. Primarily water savings for measures that are associated with water using devices. And it's not really, it doesn't really fit real well in the societal cost test, but it does fit in the TRC test. And Mid-American also wants to use this TRM to calculate savings in our South Dakota jurisdiction. And that kind of gets a little bit to the regional aspect of this, and I'll put that off till later when we talk about that. But we're using this for just a little bit more than just Iowa. Mid-American has energy efficiency in 3 different states, and we want this to be comprehensive enough that we can use this for other cost effectiveness tests just besides the Iowa societal test. So we're in states where we use the TRC, primarily South Dakota. We like to include things like water savings, and that's what we're talking about here primarily.
And I'll jump in on the other question. I think we took a state approach just because that's how we're doing things right now. We don't have a particular regional driver at this point, although it's conceivable that if you got to a clean power plan, there might be some regional compliance opportunities, but right now we just didn't have that type of infrastructure in place, and we're ready to move forward on it. So we just did it on a state basis. We haven't decided exactly where the TRM will be publicly available, although it is certainly our desire that it will be. So it's useful to the various contractors who have to interface with it and use it for reflecting savings in the programs that they assist in administering. I think we don't want to get the cart too far in front of the horse, and so we're looking for our regulatory commission to give its blessing to the effort, and then I think finding a public home for the TRM and making sure we engage in those periodic updates so that it is and continues to be a useful product will be steps for the future.
Jennifer, do you have a date or approximate date for when they'll be first complete?
Sure. Well, we will be submitting the TRM to our regulators third quarter of this year, and we'll be looking for guidance from them probably by the end of the year.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you very much again, Chuck and Jennifer, and we'll talk some more about regional versus state TRMs, I think, after Tina's presentation. So with that, let me please introduce Dr. Tinajayaweera, who is a senior analyst at the Northwest Power and Conservation Council. At the council, she works primarily on energy efficiency issues, such as the development and implementation of the council's regional power plan. She's also involved in furthering development of demand response in the region. Prior to joining the council, she was a principal in the Energy Service Division and had the planning and assessment team for the Cadmus Group, a consulting firm, where she led a study of TRMs I referenced in my presentation. So with that, Tina, please take it away.
Okay, thank you, Steve. So I'm going to talk about what we have in the Pacific Northwest as a technical reference manual. Now, we don't actually call it the technical reference manual, but it falls under that type of database or resource that Steve was talking about earlier. But before I get into too much about what the TRM includes, I need to give a little bit of background on some of the key organizations in the region to provide some context. So the first organization is the Bonneville Power Administration. So the BPA, or the Bonneville, is a federal agency that markets wholesale electric power from the hydroelectric dams in the Columbia River Basin. And I'll show you on the next slide what the dams look like. So we have a number of dams. About half of our energy comes from these dams, and the Bonneville Power Administration is what markets those primarily to the public utilities, but also to the investor-owned utilities. And then the other organization is the Northwest Power and Conservation Council, which is what I am part of. And this was formed in 1980 through an act of Congress, the Northwest Power Act. And basically, our mandate is to help ensure that the power that comes out of the Columbia River system is treated reliably and affordably and is well managed. And part of that mandate is actually, and this is in the Power Act, is to treat energy efficiency as a priority resource in the region with, in fact, it's given a little bit of a credit over other resources, a 10% credit. So that's a little bit of the context on who we are in the region and why, in fact, we work as a regional organization. So this is just a quick slide showing all the dams that are along the Columbia River, and I could put my little arrow. So this is the Columbia River here and its tributaries, including the Snake River. So the Northwest region includes Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and western Montana. So these are all connected together through the dam system and through the Bonneville Power Administration. So those are the two of the key organizations, but the third key organization, and this is the one that sort of develops and maintains our TRM, and this is the Regional Technical Forum. So the RTF was chartered by the Northwest Power and Conservation Council in 1999 to help ensure reliable savings estimates. So we have 140 odd utilities in the region, public and IOU, and because the Power Act mandates energy efficiency as a priority resource, all of these utilities are working toward acquiring energy efficiency. And there was a question on, well, how do we know what the utilities are achieving, and how do we know that there's how do the utilities know what they should claim for these savings, and how do we know that there's consistency across these utilities? So the RTF was formed, and we have members, and I'll talk a little bit more about the membership later, though we don't have any regulatory authority. A lot of the regional regulators do rely on the RTF, and although we technically do report to the chair of the council, we actually work for the region. So we work for Bonneville, for the utilities, for the Energy Trust of Oregon, those that run efficiency programs, as well as the regulators who help ensure that those utilities are acquiring efficiency in a pragmatic and cost-effective way. So the RTF kind of has three value streams to it. First of all, everything that we do is open. We have monthly meetings, and they're open to the public. We have some vigorous dialogue that occurs in those meetings, and sort of connected to that, there's a peer review process. Because everything is open, a lot of people can review it. We do have a more formalized QA/QC process, but having a lot of different stakeholders review what we do helps make it a stronger product. And because of our regional organization, we feel that we get some economies of scale that one would find rather than doing it utility by utility or even state by state. Now we do have some challenges sometimes with having this whole region, and I could talk about it more if there's interest, but there are always questions of my service territory is different from that service territory, and how are we going to account for those differences and recognize some of the uniqueness about different areas of the region. So as I mentioned, probably our primary audience are those who deliver energy efficiency programs, the utilities, the Energy Trust, and Bonneville. Regulators use it a lot. Planners at the Northwest Power and Conservation Council, we use the work of the RTF a lot in developing our power plan. Also utilities that do conservation potential assessments, they rely a lot on the work of the RTF. And finally, and very importantly, evaluators can rely on the RTF savings estimates and the methodology developed. So there's this regional technical forum. As I mentioned, we have members of the RTF, and in fact there are 30 voting members, but we also have corresponding members, and also the meetings are open to the public. So anybody could come in and participate. Most of the members are actually serving pro bono because their organizations find that there's value in the RTF, and they want to have that representation on the RTF and to help further its mission. We have members that come from a wide variety of stakeholders in the region, utilities, the Northwest Energy Efficiency Alliance, Bonneville, and so on. And so we get a very broad perspective on energy efficiency, I think, in these meetings. And as I said, we meet monthly in our regular meetings, and then there's a number of subcommittees that will meet sort of on an ad hoc or as needed basis. And the funding from this does come from the utilities and other Bonneville and the Energy Trust. And I'll talk about funding a little bit more later on. Okay, so how does the RTF work? So we have guidelines, and this has evolved over the 17 years that the RTF has been in existence. And I think it's maybe about 5 years ago they started working on these guidelines that lay out how to make decisions about what the Regional Technical Forum is, or how it assesses savings and costs and other attributes of energy efficiency measures. So this flow chart here kind of shows, I'm not going to go into details, but shows the different aspects of estimating savings. So similar to what they're doing in Iowa, we look not only just at savings, which includes energy savings, but also peak savings. We also look at the costs and the benefits, including non-energy impacts, and we also have guidelines for our lifetime. So all of this information gets boiled down into assessments for each energy efficiency measure to help promote consistency on how these are claimed and used throughout the region. So looking at the energy efficiency measures, part of our guidelines, the strength of our guidelines, I think, is that we have this classification system for them. And it's broken up into three main categories. We have our savings estimation method, we have our measure category, and we have our measure status. And I'll walk through each of these more in detail. Oops, one too many. So first of all, the method. So we have 4 different methods that we use, 2 of which the RTF has a lot of rigor around and approves at what are called unit energy savings, as well as standard protocols. And this is where the bulk of our work is. For the unit energy savings, we have 75 measure workbooks, which accounts for hundreds of measures and thousands of different measure applications. So this is probably the vast majority of our effort is on this unit energy savings. These standard protocols are more like calculators. So non-residential lighting is a good example for a standard protocol where a simple number is not sufficient, but you could have a calculator that inputs, where the light is going in, what type of lighting it is, type of building, etc., and that will then calculate what the savings are for that measure. And then there are 2 other categories of measures, which are the standard protocol and the program impact evaluation. And so the protocol and the impact evaluation, currently mostly the RTF has high-level guidance on them. We haven't gone into specific measure-by-measure guidance. It's more a high-level review to provide information for utilities and evaluators to follow what our recommended protocol is. We are looking into, for program impact evaluation, making a measure specific, and we're looking at residential behavior as our first example there. So we are thinking about digging in further into measure by measure for these, but currently these 2 are more high-level guidance information. Okay, so going forward, I'm going to mostly focus on this unit energy savings and the standard protocol. And basically for these, we have these 4 categories, but it's actually simpler than this. It's basically, is the measure proven or not proven? So proven means that we have pretty high confidence in what the savings represent. And this is what most would call a deemed savings, and it has reliability around it. If it doesn't have that reliability, then we break it up into 2 other categories. Provisional and planning, which basically say we need more research done to really know what the savings are. And then we have, if it's a small measure, there's not a huge impact on the regional conservation savings, then we put it in the small saver category, which says, well, it's not as rigorous as proven, but there's not going to be a lot of work around it, so we can accept a lower level of accuracy. The next way we classify our measures is under the status. So active is that we have everything looks good, we meet all the requirements in the guidelines, go ahead, use them, we're happy with these savings. Under review means that maybe we're going through a QA/QC process on it, so we're not quite there yet. Maybe there is a new data set that came in that might impact what assumptions we had made in developing our unit energy savings. So under review means that we're pretty comfortable with it, but we're still kind of looking at it, and so hold on maybe a little bit. And then we finally have the deactivated measures, where perhaps 2 years ago we were able to develop this measure, unit energy savings, but a new federal standard came in where now those savings are no longer appropriate, so we deactivate that measure. where basically the data just aren't there anymore and there's not enough really value in the region anymore to go forward with what the savings are. So I've been talking a lot about these unit energy savings, and the term that's generally used is deemed savings, but we call them unit energy savings, but it's basically the same thing. So these are what I think most people think about in a TRM as saying this unit, this light bulb, this LED here saves 12 kilowatt hours a year, and that's the unit energy savings. So it's again where we have some easy to apply estimates for savings for widgets or measures that could be delivered and verified that there's been delivery. And so to get to an energy, a unit energy savings number, we rely on a lot on evaluation data. So we use statistical or metastatistical analysis like you do in evaluation work. We also use calibrated engineering models. Some of you may be familiar with Energy Plus or the DO2 models. We have one that's called SEAM that we use. And so this is kind of using evaluated energy savings to come up with an estimate for a deemed measure. So with all that together, this is kind of a picture here of what our TRM is. So it's not a document or a PDF like a lot of regional TRMs are. It's actually a collection of workbooks that are posted on our website, and this is the page for the unit energy savings. So you can see here that we have measures that could be categorized by sector. Then we have the measure itself, and there's some descriptors within there showing categorization. And then here's our category. So as I mentioned, each one is either proven, which is the highest level of rigor, or there's planning and provisional, depending on how much research is out there or needed for it. The status is primarily active. We do have these commercial dishwashers that were a measure a few years ago, but they've been deactivated for lack of interest or lack of savings. And then we have our active ones that are, we're feeling pretty good about what data we have represents our best estimates to date. And then under review means that we're, maybe waiting for some data to come in, or that there's some QA/QC process going on. The other thing I wanted to mention for our measures is that we have a sunset date associated with them. So every measure has some sort of timeline under which that measure needs to be reviewed again. And these could be changed if more data come in. We might change these sunset dates, but this is to help ensure that our measures are being constantly refreshed and that we aren't forgetting about something and going stale. So some of these measures, the sunset date may be driven by a pending federal standard that's coming in, or it may be pending some research that we're expecting to come in, or it may just be several years out into the future to remind ourselves basically that we need to look at this again to make sure that what we have is the most up to date. Now, all of this, as you might imagine, takes some money to do, and so the RTF has a budget associated with it. And this budget is about $1.6 million a year. So it's a significant amount of money. A relatively small chunk of it goes to the management. We have an official RTF manager who helps guide this process along. We also have dedicated RTF contract analyst staff that do a lot of the work to update the measures, similar to what VEIC would do for Iowa. And as you can see here, most of this part of the budget is really focusing on keeping those measure savings up to date, doing any sort of analysis required. The RTF does not do primary research, but we take the data that others gather and try to update our savings through that. So with that, I'm just going to move on to kind of finish up with highlighting what I think are the key attributes of the Regional Technical Forum that maybe differentiate it from some other regions, but also I think are what make it work well and make it a robust source of energy savings. So as I mentioned, we have an RTF manager who guides this process. We have an annual budget, and we have long-term funding commitments, so we are able to plan several years in advance on the type of work that we can do. We follow these guidelines, which lay out how we estimate or how we define what the savings and the costs and the lifetimes are. And we're continually updating our assumptions. So every measure has a cycle to it on its own. It's not a single document. We have our dedicated contract analyst staff that are working to review these measures and gather data from the region to improve our estimates. As I mentioned, everything is publicly available, so we get a lot of third-party review on our data and our assumptions, and we get people to bring their perspective forward. And finally, as part of the guidelines, we have quality standards, we have a measure status, and we have sunset dates. So all of these things together, I think, help ensure that our document is, or not our document, but our assumptions are well-grounded and up to date. So with that, I'll open to any questions. And I do want to mention Jennifer Light, who's the RTF manager. She is able to answer all and any questions about the RTF if you have more in the future, and to encourage you to go to our website, which, as I mentioned, includes everything on it, all the meeting minutes, all the work papers, all the references, anything you can imagine is on the RTF website. So with that, I'll open up to questions.
Well, thanks, Tina. Thank you very much for that presentation. And we do have some time left. We're aiming to end in about 8 minutes or so at a quarter after the hour. But I want to start with a couple of clarifying, or actually one specific clarifying question for you, which is you had mentioned the process and thoughts on, adding, updating measures. Is there a specific schedule that you follow for updating the TRM, or is it a continuous process, or how does that work?
It's a continuous process. So if, as I mentioned, each measure, I'm going to go back a couple of slides. So each measure has a sunset date. So depending on the measure itself, a month or 3 months or 6 months before that sunset date, the contract analyst will start focusing in right now it's all his work on updating that measure. So or if we get significant new data, we may refresh that measure as well. That's before the sunset date. So we're on a continual cycle of reviewing these measures, and as I said, we have monthly meetings, so depending on what measures may be up for sunset, what new data come in, we will review it at that next RTF meeting.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, I think experience across the country indicates that there's processes such as yours, which are essentially continuous as people identify new measures, as well as, per your sunset clauses here. But some states will have an actual schedule that I've seen anywhere from once a year, or every other year, or perhaps every 3 years, with some opportunity to update if there's new measures that are identified. The other question I have for you, Tina, sort of leading into perhaps a little more discussion about the regional versus the state TRM and the possibility of using existing state TRMs. A couple questions came in around, how does that regional aspect of the TRM work, given that you have, different jurisdictions? You mentioned all the different, many, different utilities, different utility commissions. Do you have any feedback or comments about how working among many different jurisdictions and interests, how that goes, and any thoughts you have for others?
Sure. Yeah. So because the council, the Northwest Power Act was 1980, and that sort of led off the development of energy efficiency in this region, I think we have a long history of working and thinking regionally that other jurisdictions might not have, and so it's pretty natural for us to think regionally. Of course, each state has its own regulatory commission. They have their own needs that the different utilities will work within, and so there are different states that have kind of nuances that they apply. But because of the long history of the RTF and the region, I think that in general we get pretty good regional buy-in from all the different players. We do, when we develop and measure savings, we do look at climate as a primary driver for differences in the region. So we will have climate zone specific savings for weatherization, for example. But we, I think, have, but because of our infrastructure as it is, and because we have so many public utilities in the region that are served by Bonneville, there's this sort of common thread through everything.
Thank you. I don't know, Chuck or Jennifer, if you have any other comments about, your thoughts on, whether you thought about a regional one. I know, Jennifer, you talked a bit about that, and I think your situation is fairly common in that there's thoughts about regional and aware of other states, neighboring states in many cases that have TRMs, but it's getting that process going and finding ways to share resources with possible some differences and how the energy efficiency is evaluated, can create barriers, although there's clearly the benefit of cost savings. So I don't know, Jennifer or Chuck, if you have any more to add to that or any other comments you want to make?
I think one of the issues is something that you just mentioned. I think you gotta find partners who are kind of like-minded in terms of how they want to evaluate energy efficiency. I can tell you from experience that Illinois and Iowa probably would not be a good fit because I think even though we have used a lot of the Illinois TRM stuff in Iowa, I think the view towards how energy efficiency is evaluated is pretty different. And it's hard for me to see how kind of a regional view with Iowa and Illinois would work. The same thing goes to the west of us. In South Dakota, in Nebraska, maybe North Dakota, I mean, they are a lot more skeptical of energy efficiency in general than Iowa is. And so a regional partnership there might not work very well. I think one of the important things is to find partners that are like-minded, and that a single sort of approach to a TRM would work well for everybody in the partnership.
Well, thank you. I think to conclude here today, I want to leave and see if each of you want to comment on sort of really a fundamental question that came in from one of the audience, which is, what is the perception of deemed savings values by regulators and utilities, how they use them, do they consider them conservative, and maybe, have that as our last comments from each of you if you want to talk about what your experience has been is how these values are seen. Are they trusted and considered conservative or realistic?
Well, this is Jennifer. I'll start
Sure.
off. I don't think that there is at least in Iowa, I don't think there is our particular point of view about deemed savings value being conservative or not. In our case, I think we're concerned about setting goals on savings that are overly conservative. But I think our primary goal here is to come up with a product, a technical reference manual that assures consistency and transparency, and is well sourced so that we're all planning and documenting from a common set of principles.
Chuck or Tina, anything you'd like to add?
No.
I'll just say from the RTF's perspective, the regulators, because of our process where our deemed savings are largely based on evaluation data, and they're sort of, to use the Latin terminology, they're ex post estimates of savings. They're after a lot of data come in. The regulators tend to have pretty high level of confidence in the savings estimates, and but within our guidelines, we try to give an indicator of how much confidence they should have in them based on whether it's under review or based on whether it's provisional versus proven. So I feel that there's a lot of buy-in from the regulators in general on the estimates that the RTF comes up with, and especially because we have a large variety of stakeholders involved in the process.
Okay. Well, I will take the prerogative as the facilitator to sort of provide some last comments from myself that, I think a lot of the trust in the TRMs and the deemed savings values depends on the process and who was preparing them, so that if there's the opportunity to, have very open, transparent calculations and background in a process, such as it sounds like I was going through, and I know the regional technical forum does in the Northwest, to have that very open, that creates a lot of confidence in that process, so that they know, what's being done. For all the parties are aware of that, and also that the values aren't necessarily biased to be conservative or aggressive savings values, but values that are the most likely values. So try to shoot for that middle range of between conservative and aggressive savings as to what would be the most expected values. And as I mentioned during my presentation, realizing that the values might not be appropriate for each individual case, but on average can provide quite good values, perhaps even better than doing short-term measurements. So with that, I want to come to a conclusion here as we reach a little over our time period here. I want to certainly thank all our presenters, Tina, Chuck, and Jennifer, and for LBL and the Department of Energy that's funding this, and all our co-sponsors at EPA, NASIO, and NARUC. I want to thank all our audience for joining us. Our next webinar will probably be in July or early August on baselines. And these slides and the recording of the presentation will be available on the LBL EM&V webinar website shortly. So thank you, and you all enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.